When I was about 16, I needed to get a job. I was out of high school and living with my parents who were driving me insane. I needed to get out. I was applying for jobs everywhere I could find. I would walk into a store and immediately ask if they were hiring. I didn't really care where I worked. I just needed the money to get out of my current living situation. The local grocery store was having a mass hiring job fair type deal on a specific day and time. I woke up early, got ready, and went. Everyone looking to get a job had to stand in a line and wait to be interviewed. No big deal. I just fumbled with my phone while I waited. The guy in front of me was standing sideways so he could easily face me and anyone behind me. He continually asked me questions like, "Is this your first job? How old are you? How far would you have to drive to get to work here?" After the last one, I sarcastically told him I didn't know. I thought he got the point because he stopped talking to me soon after. We got further up in line, and finally, he was being interviewed in the little office. It was really just a set of tall pieces of cardboard that gave the illusion of privacy during your interview. It was set up right in front of the grocery store too, so anyone walking outside could see you during it. I was getting nervous because I really wanted the job. When he got done and came out, he said, "Hope you get the job, Cutie. I'd love to see more of you," and walked past me. If it weren't for the interview coming up, I probably would have told him to get lost. Anyway, I got into the makeshift cubicle or whatever, and the guy handed me some papers and told me to fill them out. I did so and handed them back to him when I finished. When I lifted my head up, I saw behind the man interviewing me was that same creep from before, standing a little bit away, trying to hide and watching me during my interview. I had already been reasonably anxious before, but now I was starting to really worry. I tried my best to make it through without looking at him and answer the questions I was being asked. Occasional glances toward that man, though rewarded me with witnessing the creep groping the glass, having his hand down his pants, and jerking off. Finally, he began to take pictures of me with his phone. I was ready to call the cops as soon as I got out of there if he was still around. When my interview was wrapping up, I was given some pamphlets and a gift card for a few bucks off groceries. I shook hands with the interviewer, and when I looked back at the window, the man was no longer there. Relief washed over me. I went to leave and hoped to God I didn't just mess up my interview because of that distraction. I walked through the grocery store back to the door I'd entered in, and shortly after walking outside, I saw the man leaning up against the wall, waiting for me. I pulled my keys out and put them between my knuckles like I was taught to do at a young age. My other hand went straight to my pocket, grabbing hold of my phone. I started to walk towards my car, and as I walked past him, he stepped to walk beside me. "So, how'd it go?" "You're really too cute to be working at a grocery store, you know. You'd make a lot more money without even having to leave your house if you just went online." It was disgusting, but I said nothing. "Oh, so you're gonna be like that, huh?" Not gonna say anything to me. Probably a good idea, because if you open that mouth of yours, I'd be tempted to stick my... I cut them off by swinging around towards him and punching him in the throat with my key. Unfortunately, my grip on my keys wasn't tight enough, and they fell out of my hand on impact. That was enough to shut him up, though, and get him choking. I grabbed my keys off the ground and sprinted for my car. He was following after me, calling me names and other vulgarities that I can't remember. I jumped into my car and locked it just in time as he began to slam his fists on my driver's side window. I was shaking like crazy. I pulled out my phone, and after a few feeble attempts from my shaking hands, I correctly dialed 911. He was pounding on my window, shouting about how I assaulted him, trying to open my doors, walking around to see if any of the doors were unlocked. I tried my best to talk to the dispatcher and tell them where I was at. When he got back to my driver's side door and continued to pound on it and cuss at me, I held my phone up to the window. He could see I dialed 911. And on that note, his face went white. He looked around and casually walked away. I waited a bit before telling the dispatcher I thought he was gone. They didn't want to send out a patrol if he'd already left. The dispatcher got the description of the man from me and told me they'd have someone come out and look at the grocery store's camera footage. They would talk to the guy who interviewed me as well to see if they could find out who the guy was. I never heard from the man again, and thankfully, to my knowledge, as I frequent this store quite regularly, the man did not get the job. Unfortunately, neither did I. Before my mom married my dad, she dated a man named Craig. At first, he was sweet, but he slowly became abusive over time. My mom tried to leave multiple times, but Craig always threatened her. After one particularly violent argument, my mom waited and fled in the middle of the night. The years passed by and she got married and had me. My dad's work included a lot of traveling, so it was mostly my mom and I at home, alone in our big acreage home. I remember my mom was in the kitchen, baking lasagna while I was sitting in my high chair. It was extremely hot that day, so she opened the kitchen door to let in some air. All of a sudden, she heard heavy footsteps enter the kitchen behind her. My excited mom assumed it was my dad returning and whipped around with a "Hello, my love." Her excitement immediately turned to horror, though. There was Craig standing in the middle of our kitchen with a gun visibly tucked into his pants. Craig smiled at her and asked her what she was making. My mom mustered enough courage and told him she was making lasagna. She was physically shaking as Craig sat himself down beside me. He playfully pinched my cheek, and I remember laughing at him. My mom was holding back tears as she asked him what he was doing inside our house. Craig said he only wanted to visit my mom, and he would leave after we were done eating. When the lasagna was ready, she served it to him. My mom took me and sat across from Craig so she could keep a better eye on him. He said he still had her things at his house, and she was welcome to come by and get them soon. She told him she no longer needed any of it, and he could simply throw it out. He started to get very agitated and said she'd thrown him away like garbage too. Craig said she was acting tough, but he knew deep down she was still the stupid little girl he had dated. He claimed my mom needed him in her life and that she couldn't function if he wasn't there to help her. He said he needed to be there to raise me because my dad was a slur who could never be able to protect my mom or me. He said if he really was crazy, he could have easily kidnapped us or done things to my mom right now. Because my dad was just a... My mom started to cry and told Craig to leave right now. He said it wasn't her house anymore, and he had every right to be there. My mom said if he didn't leave, she would call the police, which obviously made him angry. He threatened that if the cops got involved, he would hire people to cut her into pieces and film it as well. My mom started to cry even more. Craig then threw his plate and screamed at her to stop crying right now. I got scared and started to cry too, which caused Craig to stand up and approach my mom. She jumped out of her chair and cradled me in her arms. She begged for Craig to at least spare my life. He tried to reach over to touch my mom, but she got so scared she fell to the floor, sobbing. At that exact moment, the phone began to ring. I guess Craig had become so overwhelmed or something that he just sprinted out of the house. The cops and his family found him about to shoot himself in the head after my mom called the police. His adult son had to convince him not to do it. My mom was so traumatized she didn't want to deal with any of it. She simply got a restraining order against him. She and my dad moved across the country. After I got a bit curious recently and searched this guy up to see what he was doing, I was shocked to see he was dating a college. Who looked just like the woman he could never have. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I always was so amazed at the beauty of the area and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages out on that lake during summer. The lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, So people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with their family and friends. I spent pretty much every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter, and the sounds of motorboats out on the lake. But the winters were very different. The people that didn't live there all year round would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area almost completely deserted, with the cottages all boarded up for the winter. There were a few people who would still frequently come up every couple of months for a few days or so. But for the most part, the lake was completely silent during the winters, and the town was only filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees were always covered in snow, making an eerie ambience. Our cottage was situated on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on that road, with ours being somewhat right in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to even see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up there to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend. I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive, but it turned out to be an 8-hour drive this time due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through the park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black, except for the headlights of our car. We finally passed through, with only about 30 minutes left to arrive at our destination. It had finally stopped snowing, and we were both just eager to get there. As we turned down a familiar road, I remember my dad cursing a storm. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't even be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the snowy road, we noticed there seemed to be a fresh set of tire tracks. The Smiths must be up for the weekend, my dad said. All of a sudden, as we drove around the bend following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost completely hidden by the vast trees that were covered in snow, hiding in the darkness. "What the?" my dad mumbled as we drove past this van. I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing two figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. As I told my dad this, he simply shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe they're lost or something." I nodded. But I couldn't help but think about how this was a dead-end road. So why would they feel the need to park there, of all places? As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing in all our stuff, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right here. I couldn't stop thinking about that van. Why was it there with two people just sitting in the dark in the middle of a snowing night? It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him. I didn't want to sleep alone downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest. My 15-year-old self was already scared enough of the dark. I didn't need to see the white van creeping around. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there. But not alone, and not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off already, so I was using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet I could almost hear my own ears ringing. Suddenly, I started to get the feeling that I was now being watched. The living room also had large windows with no curtains that overlooked the lake. It was completely black outside, except for a single light from some cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now, the cottage was completely dark. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was quite a beautiful sight, actually. I walked toward the window a bit to get a better look. As I did so, movement caught the corner of my eye. I remember my heart dropping as I saw two figures down by the back porch, crouched below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled toward the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I couldn't be sure if they had seen me or not. I hardly woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the two figures were long gone. Where I had seen the figures, though, were 2 sets of footprints in the snow, which led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare the intruders off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but he still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I was extremely freaked out though. I lay there all night next to my dad. Terrified, I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, we went outside and confirmed there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the road to behind our cottage, then back around to the front and back up the road. There were also tire marks that showed a vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was in the middle of winter, and not too many people were at the lake. Thing is, though, these guys knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading up to the cottage and my dad's car parked up front. They would also have seen the lamp I'd turned on to read, or at least seen it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for the winter. I still wonder to this day, though, why would they be interested in stealing from the only house that clearly had people still inside it?